G'day everyone, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our webinar series. I can see our attendees coming through the door, so to speak. We've had more than 1,000 people register for today's webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Canberra's Ngunnawal country, and sovereignty was never ceded. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are on the webinar with us today. During the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary. So check out tai.org.au/webinars so you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we begin today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists, or you should be able to upvote other people's questions and make comments. Please keep things civil in the chat or we'll boot you out. We don't often have to do that. You're all pretty well behaved and thank you very much for doing so. Some people do find the chat distracting, but we did a poll last week and most people wanted to keep it. If you do find it distracting, you can minimize it. Click on it, put it up as a separate pop-up screen and move it to the side. That's a little bit less distracting. And lastly, this is being recorded and will be posted on our website and emailed to all of you after this discussion. So I'm really excited about today's webinar. As you will all know, the United States is just weeks away from its presidential election, and it could hardly be more consequential for the United States or indeed for the rest of the world. And we know many of you have a keen interest in US politics. Focus has been a lot on the pandemic, which has seen more than 200,000 Americans tragically and mostly needlessly lose their lives. But today we wanted to focus on another existential threat that we all face, and that's climate change. And we're going to be talking about exactly what's at stake and hinging on the outcome of the election. And so I'm delighted to introduce our three guests today: Bob Inglis, Lucy Turnbull, a bonus guest, Scott Heron, if we can get him on the line, and of course, Allan Behm from the Australia Institute. For those who don't know, Bob Inglis is the founder and executive director of republicen.org. He's a conservative Republican who represented a deeply conservative district in South Carolina for many years. And Bob is that rarest of things in politics nowadays, a politician who changed their mind on an issue because he was persuaded by the science and the facts. And he moved from being a climate skeptic to a climate advocate, and I'll let him tell you about that story in a little while. But the Australia Institute was delighted to host Bob and his wife Marianne for an Australian tour back in 2017 to talk about climate change from a conservative perspective and how conservatives can stay true to their free market values and address the climate crisis. It's a really influential tour. Then ABC political editor and National Press Club president Chris Uhlmann described his address to the National Press Club as one of the best speeches he'd heard that year. And for his work on climate change, Bob was given the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profiling Courage Award, and we're delighted he could join us again today. Lucy Turnbull is a businesswoman and philanthropist. She's an urbanist with a long-standing interest in cities and technological and social innovation. From 2015 to 20, she was the inaugural Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission, tasked by the New South Wales Government to assist in delivering strong and effective strategic planning for the whole of metropolitan Sydney. She was also the first female Lord Mayor of Sydney from 2003-04, and in 2011 she became an Officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished service to the community, local government and business. Prior to her time in local government, she worked for several years as a solicitor, investment banker, and in the Family Investment Office. And she and her husband, Malcolm Turnbull, over many decades have been involved in supporting many medical, research, social, and cultural institutions. Scott Heron is an oceanographer working alongside the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and he works primarily on the Great Barrier Reef Watch program, and he's an adjunct principal research fellow in physics at James Cook University. And it was Scott who helped change Bob Inglis's mind on climate. And lastly, Allan Behm, director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program at the Australia Institute. It was a long introduction, 5 minutes, but welcome everyone. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Bob, I might come to you first. I wonder if, for people who aren't familiar with your story, can you tell us how you came to change your mind on climate change for people, who don't know your backstory?
Yes, well, it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wish it could be in person like it was in 2017, because that was fabulous to be in your beautiful country. So, well, let's see. I spent 6 years saying that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented probably one of the most conservative districts in America, that was the end of the inquiry for me. So I admit that's pretty ignorant. But that's the way it was for 6 years in Congress. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law. Had the opportunity to run for Congress yet again, the same seat, one of the 6 U.S. House districts at the time from South Carolina. So that was 2004. My son had just turned 18, so he was voting for the first time. And he came to me and he said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. This was a new constituency. You know, these people can change the locks on the doors. Very important to respond to those people. So that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. By the way, my son was going to vote for me no matter what, right? I mean, it wasn't in his economic interest to vote against me. I mean, he knew that we were mortgaging the farmette that we live on, literally, in order to run for Congress. You know what a farmette is? That's when you're not really a farmer. You just pretend to be a farmer. You know, we've got chickens and horses and dogs and cats in a great big garden. We pretend to be farmers. So he knew we were mortgaging the farmette. He was going to vote for me no matter what. What he's really saying, I think, was, "Dad, I love you, and you can be better than you were before. So how about make this English 2.0, the new and improved version?" So that was step 1 of this 3-step metamorphosis. Second step was going to Antarctica with the science committee, seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. And then the third step was at the Great Barrier Reef, snorkeling with Scott Heron, who I hope will be on the call. And I could see that Scott and I shared a worldview before any words were spoken, because I could see that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me at the Great Barrier Reef. We were snorkeling together. He'd go down, he'd show me something. We'd come to the surface and he'd tell me what he'd just shown me. And I could just see in his eyes and written all over his face, is in his voice, that he was worshiping God and what he was showing me. Wasn't worshiping the corals. He's worshiping the creator behind the corals. And so I knew we shared a worldview, but later we had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes that he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. People who come after us, you know. And so I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, who's become now a very dearest friend, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession when you represent perhaps the reddest district, the most conservative district in America. It won't go well for you. It didn't go well at all. After 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote, and the other guy got the other 71% of the vote. And so at that point, a foundation came to me and said, "You know, Inglis, you're an unusual zoo animal, an actual conservative who says climate change is real. You speak and write for the proposition." And that's what I've been doing ever since, you know. And I will tell you, the food's been pretty good, and the cage has been delightful, particularly in 2017 when I got to come to Australia. So, you know, that's what I've been doing ever since. Now it's republicen.org. It's a team of 6 of us facilitating a community of about 10,000 people that we need to grow with a couple of zeros on the end of that. And then hopefully make a difference among American conservatives and their ability to hear it in their own language. So that's what we're about, is convincing conservatives to enter the conversation about climate change.
Well, a noble pursuit indeed, and definitely a very necessary one. Before we move on to you, Lucy, Bob, if I can just follow up, obviously, since we last spoke to you in 2017, America's quite a different place now. You've always described yourself as an energy optimist. How much is that optimism holding up under the Trump administration?
Well, it's been severely challenged, yes, it's well, I should disclose right off the bat that I've joined Biden's Republicans for Biden. So if it gives you any idea about how concerned I am, it is that I think we need a new president, and I think that America needs to help lead the world to a solution on climate change, and surely. That's one of the key issues for me, as well as others. It's not just climate change that would cause me to say that Donald Trump is not the person I wish to be in the White House. So it's been really something of a nightmare, to tell you the truth. So yes, we describe ourselves as energy optimist and climate realist. And yes, Ebony, I'm trying to remain optimistic, but it has been. Well, I'm optimistic that the nightmare will end. Remember that Gerald Ford, when he became president after Richard Nixon resigned, spoke to the American people, and the first words out of his mouth were, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." So I hope for a repeat of those words on November the 3rd.
Allan, I might go to you now.
Bob, thank you very much for that. And your opening remarks have brought really into focus a problem that we've had in Australia now for quite a long time, which is the deep political divide, really, over climate change. And your remarks about the relationship between faith and science, I think, is really quite interesting, because in Australia's case, many of the opponents of the climate change science seem to have been people of faith. I mean, perhaps the greatest warrior was the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who just deconstructed all of the legislation that went through under the Gillard government to bring in a carbon price. And so I thought, Lucy, I'd ask you to talk a little bit about the political divide in Australia and how it might be possible to cross over that. I mean, I began school in 1950 in an Australia which was highly sectarian religiously. And by the time we got through the later years of the Menzies government, particularly, I think, state aid to schools, that sectarianism began to evaporate. And we don't have it anymore in any real sense. And yet it's been replaced by a kind of political sectarianism, which is deeply vicious, and particularly, I think, around climate change. And I wonder how you think about that, given that as a conservative yourself, you often adopt evidence-based and science-based positions. And why can't everybody else do that?
Well, thank you very much, Allan. I would see myself as a centrist, a sort of like a centre-right person. I'm not on the extreme right, and I don't think I could claim to be on the extreme left. So, it's a phenomenon that's actually been happening in the US and in Australia, and it's played out in slightly different ways. And I think it's this sort of extreme polarization in society, which is very manifest now. But I would like to see it becoming a little bit less manifest in this presidential election than it was in 2016. I might be hideously optimistic there, but like Bob, I'm an energy optimist and an environmental optimist, but we really have to get cracking. But the polity of Australian politics has been polarised, just like it has in the US. And climate has been, if you like, the signifier of where you stand in that political divide to a great degree. So there are a lot of people across the political spectrum who have a great deal of conviction, and I'd rather use the word conviction than belief, because belief is sort of has a connotation of religious faith and stuff. You know, there are a lot of people who are have huge level of conviction about the fact that climate change is with us, that we have to act. The problem is that the polarization makes it hard to do that, because you have the people for whom belief and values, you know, belief that it isn't a problem, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence that it is, and they, you know, have a very loud voice in a lot of political debate, aided by very large media organisations, especially one which crosses both the US and Australia and other countries besides. So we have had a kind of like a fragmented, a sort of deeply polarised conversation. And I think it's a symptom of the fragmentation of politics around the world, which has been the case. Really, I think it started, I mean, I was only in primary school in these days, and I have to say, Alan, you look like a child. I can't believe you started school in 1950. But you know, I think that one of the beginning points of this was actually the Vietnam War, where you had, and I guess the politics of liberation of women and sexual liberation and stuff like that. That kind of, you know, heavily, you know, intense debate and dialogue and conversation really changed politics forever. And I think the revolution, the sort of revolution in Paris, etc., in 1968, you know, like I guess the social revolution of 1968 also had the effect of giving a huge voice to people who believed that society needed to change on the one hand, which led to a huge reaction against change on the other. So the world was set up, certainly the US and Australia has been set up for this dueling between liberal progressive views on the one hand and conservative views on the other. And as somebody who, you know, like it's sometimes hard to sit in the middle, but I see myself as very much in the middle. It's a hard one to comprehend, and I think, but it's a really important one that we have to grapple with. And the thing that I guess really distresses and perplexes me is that the climate change, if you like, momentum was stalled massively during the global financial crisis, certainly in the US and also in Australia. I think, you know, the economic anxiety sort of fed into people saying, oh, not now, not now. And now we have the COVID pandemic, which of course has killed 210,000 people, and which is terrifying, Bob. And I know that the Carolinas have been badly affected by this, and it's flaring up again. And in Australia, we have incredible, I guess, sympathy and concern with what you're going through in the US. But what it's done is it's silenced the climate debate at the same time in the mainstream. And we've got to be able to have lots of conversations at the same time, including about the climate change and energy crisis.
If I might just pick up on what Lucy was saying there, Bob, here in Australia, we really noticed that a Conservative government that has been quite hostile to evidence on climate change during the pandemic really listened to experts, to the science, to what the medical fraternity was telling them to do and how to respond. And I guess I wanted to ask you to reflect on why it is in some countries Conservatives have found it difficult to listen to the science and tackle climate as they have done in America and Australia, whereas some other countries led by Conservative governments, whether that's in the United Kingdom or Germany or even Conservative parties in places like New Zealand, seem to have, you know, not much trouble at all addressing it or even running on it as a virtue. Is there anything that you can pick out there on the difference between those kinds of countries and the way that your government under Trump has responded? Oh, hang on. I think you're on mute there. Hang on. No, we can't hear you anymore, unfortunately, Bob. As you're...
Bob.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you could... No, we still can't hear you there. Might you be able to pop out and pop back in again? Because we can't hear you at all. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm back.
Yep.
You hear me okay? Great.
Yep.
Okay. So, yes. Well, we might wish for Australia's ability to handle the COVID crisis, or New Zealand's ability to handle the COVID crisis. We seem to be having quite a struggle here in the U.S. with that. So as to why it is that we do, however, share this thing about a climate rejectionism that comes in conservative clothing. Part of it may be, as Lucy just said, we share a particular news organization that has a great deal to do with that. If you look at Fox viewers in America, that's where you find the climate disputation. And really, for us at republican.org, it's the Holy Grail. If Fox would just change, or if the Wall Street Journal editorial page would just change, either one of those, and this would be finished. We'd be done with climate. We'd be acting. So it really is that important. So if anybody can get to the Murdochs, please let me know.
I might just follow up there too, because you've got some very specific proposals, Bob, on how to address things, as like you mentioned with the carbon tax, but you've also talked about it being like a border adjustable tax and those kinds of things. Is that what you're hoping to see out of a Biden administration, and what might the implications be for a country like Australia that's been a laggard on climate action as well?
Well, and you know, like I said in 2017, I don't presume to tell Australians how to run your country. I do hope that we can help lead in America by having an economy that a lot of people want access to do a carbon pricing mechanism that makes it so that the world follows. That, of course, is a challenge in Australia's case, figuring out how to make it in the world's interest to follow. But if, for example, China wants access to the American market and we internalize the negative externalities associated with the burning of fossil fuels. Now that sounded like an economist, didn't it? I'm not an economist, but basically the idea is to have the price of products reflect the true cost of all the bad things that happen along the way in the soot and the CO2. If we accomplish that through a carbon pricing mechanism and then apply that to imports, we think that we can make it in China's interest to follow our lead. And then if you got America and China in on the deal, you got the rest of the world in their interest following as well. And then you got the whole world, 7 billion people, seeing the true cost of the burning of fossil fuels reflected in their products. And then they start choosing other products, the competing products that don't have that price tag attached. And that's when the free enterprise system can deliver innovation. And I would submit that if conservatives in Australia, like conservatives in America, heard it that way, they'd say, oh yeah, this is our story. This is our song. We can sing that tune. Then that's what we've got to do. We've got to have them hear it in that language of free enterprise innovation. And so that's what, as to whether Joe Biden will do that or not, I think so. And here's, this is maybe deep into American political system, but as you know, we've got a Supreme Court justice nomination underway. Assuming that she gets confirmed, and that is the assumption, then probably there's 6 votes against using the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2. And so the case Massachusetts versus EPA, which established the ability of the Obama administration to pursue the Clean Power Plan, could evaporate or be reversed. And if it is, then it leaves Joe Biden with the need to do a legislative solution for climate. In other words, get something passed through Congress. And at that point, what I hope is that it becomes a pricing mechanism rather than a regulatory mechanism. Because the difference is that if it's regulatory, well, it's American only. And that makes you maybe sanctimonious and moral signaling, but it doesn't get the world in. And so actually that twist and turn of the Supreme Court may actually help us get to a worldwide solution on climate, because it'll need to be legislative. And that's our chance to make it a pricing mechanism that becomes worldwide.
That's maybe the only silver lining I've heard about the confirmation hearings.
Yes, like I said, I'm an optimist. We're trying to be optimistic here.
Alan,
Lucy's an optimist too. So,
I might go back to you.
I would like to come back and follow up on your comments about the centre. One of the big problems that we had really from 2005 through to 2011 was that while we'd started off under the Howard government having a sort of informal agreement that a pricing mechanism was the way to go, and we ended up with a pricing mechanism which had a lot of safety valves attached to it for pensioners and for other people who would inevitably pay more money for their energy. We were never able to establish a centre. That polarisation in public policy just remained the name of the game. And indeed, even within the Labor Party, it was very difficult to get our backbenchers, for example, to advocate a carbon price because they couldn't understand the difference between a price and a tax. And I mean, it's not just a problem, I think, on the Conservative side in Australia. It's a problem for all of us that we can't have a calm, rational conversation around something of national significance, which requires a big centre. How do we create a big centre? Because that's what you do.
Okay, do you want to answer that?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's a really important point, but there has been a huge transformation in the landscape since 2011, which is a terrific thing, Alan and Bob and everybody on the conversation, and that is that the price of renewable energies has literally collapsed. So, you know, back in 2005, people were saying we need more renewable energy, but it was more expensive than, you know, traditional fossil fuel energy. But that's no longer the case. So there has been an energy revolution, a technology-led renewable energy revolution. And so it simplifies the challenge for us in Australia. All we need to do is to deliver the cheapest form of energy, which, by the way, is renewables plus storage. And that's deliverable. It's economically rational. So you're not having this debate between, you know, it's great for the environment, but it costs more. It does both. And that is a really big change. And that is, I think, something that's easy to sell members of the public, the wider public, and hopefully each party's backbenchers too. Because, you know, if you look at, I mean, from a political perspective, if you just look at the demographics, you know, there are a lot of older people who possibly are less animated by this than younger people. But I know I would put myself in the older people category, and I am super animated about it because I have grandchildren and I look in their eyes and I think if we don't advocate for sensible climate and energy policy, not just in Australia, but everywhere, their futures are very, very looking pretty grim. That's why I'm an optimist, but I'm deeply concerned at the same time, which is complicated, but we've got to kind of come together on this one and not do sort of residual, oh, let's give gas a chance, or let's try this, or let's keep this coal-fired plant open for another 10 years just while we figure things out. We need to act quickly and we need to act now. Now, one of the things that Bob was talking about, the carbon tax at the border, as you know, the carbon tax that was proposed by the Rudd government, and Greg, your former boss, was leading on this. It had an exemption for export industries. So there was no carbon tax if you were exporting manufactured goods. So you were carbon tax exempt. So unless there's a carbon tax at the border, it's not very fair to people who are making stuff inside a country, be it the US or China or Australia, if you can export tax-free. So the global balancing of the incentives to actually decarbonise the economy are very serious issues. And I am concerned that Australia will be very economically and sort of in terms of national interest impaired if we don't get on top of this. We are very vulnerable if the European Union puts on a carbon tax at the border, and if the US and North America and other countries put a carbon tax on the border, and if China puts a carbon tax on the border at the same time as mobilising a great deal of their own internal fossil fuel industry. So there are a whole lot of balls in the air, if you like, which pose a great threat to Australia unless we take a very firm stand on decarbonising the electricity grid and electrifying the economy.
Bob, I wondered if you might have anything to add to that, and then I can see that Scott Heron has joined us. Welcome, Scott. I thought we might come to you after that, before we go to the audience, to talk a little bit about the climate impacts on the reef at the moment, if that's all right. But Bob, firstly, I wanted to ask about that idea of the economics of renewables plus storage being so much better than a few years ago, and how the free market has really given your arguments a boost there.
Oh yeah, it's really very exciting. In fact, and it's so good to see Scott there. You're Scott. I was telling him about how you're the reason I'm doing this. So now you can substantiate that. And so yeah, when I was there with you in 2017, there was a trouble with the blackouts right in South Australia, and then along came the storage from Elon Musk and how it's working now, and what Lucy was just describing is so true. We put renewables plus storage. That's the game changer, and it's really very exciting. So, and I might just pick up too on what Lucy was just saying is this border adjustment is admittedly complicated. But I have the hope that what I tell fellow Americans is it'd be enormously complicated to do what I've just described simply, which is we're going to adjust things coming into this country if they're coming from a country that doesn't have a carbon tax. But it might be the shortest lived agency in the history of the US government. Because if it becomes in our trading partners' interest to do the same thing, then you stand up this agency, you go through all this process, and you don't need it anymore, because China then adopts a similar tax internal to China. Australia adopts a similar tax internal to Australia. And so that's the hope, that it actually becomes a non-needed agency pretty quickly. But it is what Lucy just said is so important to notice for my fellow Americans is, hey y'all, what if China starts border adjusting Boeing Dreamliners going into China from Charleston, South Carolina? Oh, now that's a turn of events. We thought we were going to run the show. No, they are taxing our stuff on entry into China. Or the EU puts theirs in place. And then our BMWs that we're sending from Spartanburg, South Carolina into Europe suddenly get charged, because we do make BMWs here. That means Bubba makes wheels. That's what BMW stands for. But anyway, so I think in Germany they have a different word for the B, but we think it's Bubba makes wheels. So it could be this border adjustment gets applied to us in America. And that would be quite a comeuppance, wouldn't it, to realize that, oh, the rest of the world may do this to us. So that helps us actually in the argument with fellow conservatives, because we're able to say, you know what, maybe we want to be driving this rather than be driven.
Scott, I'll come to you now before we go to questions from the audience. You work a lot around the Great Barrier Reef. That's your kind of primary area of research. Can you just tell us a little bit about the impact that climate is having on the reef, and why climate action is so urgent, not just in Australia, but globally?
Sure, thanks, Ebony. By way of introducing myself, I'm an associate professor in physics at James Cook University in Townsville, North Queensland. 30-degree day, so my desk is currently on the back deck, as you can see, and that's smack bang in the middle of the latitudinal range of the Great Barrier Reef. That was also the location where Bob and I first met, and he alluded there to that meeting in our discussion since, although I would hasten to say I might be one of a litany of reasons that have led to some of those developments and the leadership that we're seeing within Republic EN and in other spheres there. I don't think I need to wax for very much on this time on the impacts that we've seen in the Great Barrier Reef. In 2016, we saw an unprecedented level of impact due to high temperatures on the Great Barrier Reef. Somewhere around the ballpark, and it's an estimate of bounds, 29% of shallow water coral reefs were killed during that one event. And that event, 2016, was really, when we look at a global perspective, the culmination of a series of years that had seen globally high record temperatures. 2014 was a record year of temperatures globally. It was exceeded by a record margin to become a new record in 2015, a record again in 2016. And since that time, we have seen every year being a top 5 globally warmest year on record. 2016 on the GBR, with nearly 1/3 of corals, shallow water corals, lost, was then followed the next year by an additional 20% of corals. So now we're talking 50%, half of the shallow water coral reefs on the Great Barrier Reef impacted within 2 years. We needed a breath, we got a breath. In fact, we took 2 breaths in 2018 and 19, but this year we didn't get another breath. This year we had another wave, and we have some of the research coming out from the National Bleaching Task Force, from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies that is analysing those pieces. We have a number of scientific articles that are in review at the moment, but we have some of the popular media, The Conversation, a great piece there where some of those results were spoken to. What we're seeing in this most recent suite of events is back-to-back impacts, disturbance events, and heat stress and coral bleaching and mortality from that are only one of the disturbance events. There are other disturbances that we see, such as from the increasing severity of tropical cyclones. And that's a phenomenon that's not solely for the Great Barrier Reef. That is an influence also globally, and there are analyses of that. Perhaps not an increase in the number of tropical cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, but in the intensity of those. And of course, the impacts on bleaching of corals that we've seen, the death of corals resulting from that on the GBR, have also been occurring around the world. And through the 2014 to 2017 period, we saw cyclical responses there. I'm speaking a lot to corals because that's my area of expertise, but there are a lot of other ecosystems, terrestrial and marine, that are also impacted. And so I speak there. Sorry, there was a question.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I was just going to actually follow up on that. So moving from the marine environment and the natural environment, Lucy, this first question from the audience is going to be from you. And thank you so much for that, Scott. I think that really kind of puts it in perspective. Every Australian's probably got it on their bucket list to visit the Great Barrier Reef, and we definitely want it to be there by the time the borders open and we can go and visit Queensland again. But Lucy, this first question is really about the built environment, and I thought it might touch on your role.
That's what I can talk about.
Yeah. Yes. So we know, particularly in Western Sydney, there's a lot of heat impacts. But there's a question here from Philim that says, Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York talked about the built environment being one of the major causes of greenhouse emissions in New York, and proposed a bill that would ban, for example, glass skyscrapers as a bid to cut emissions by 30%. But he was making the point that in Australia, we haven't really touched a lot on the built environment, at least in the national conversation. So can you shed some light on that?
Well, can I come there obliquely? And that is when Scott is talking about the bleaching and devastating effects of climate change on the reef and the marine environment, and the estuarine environments too, and the natural environment generally. My area of, I guess, endeavour or expertise is more in the impact on humans in places, especially and particularly in cities. Now, in Sydney, which is on the east coast, and I know most of you probably know where it is, but it's on the east coast of Australia. It is about 70 kilometres from east to west, and it's about the same, slightly less north to south. There is a huge temperature variation between the eastern part of the city and the western part of the city. And Western Sydney is extraordinarily vulnerable to global warming. And the amount of days that are over 35 has been consistent with temperature variations that Scott's been talking about, and Bob and Allan too. It is particularly vulnerable to climate change. So unless we plan the growth of Western Sydney in a way which mitigates heat, it won't be a very livable place. And we did actually, sort of like a couple of conferences, or sort of like charrettes, I suppose you'd call them, where we asked 100 people to come in and talk about what was important for their local places across Greater Sydney. And without doubt, being able to walk to green spaces is fundamentally important. And the way that has to happen in Western Sydney is first of all, you need to have footpaths, or what you call sidewalks in the States, and often there aren't in greenfield developments, and that's wicked because it means people can't walk around. But secondly, you need tree canopy to shade people when it's 35 degrees so they will walk somewhere. And thirdly, you need to irrigate the public realm and gardens. So you need to have the water supply to mitigate urban heat. And if you don't do those very simple things, it will be very suboptimal. It's a different sort of challenge than you get in New York, which is very built up, much more like the Sydney CBD or, you know, the inner west, etc. Western Sydney is, and lots of other places in Australia are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and we have to address that. Now, energy efficiency is very important. One way we can actually do that in all buildings is to create green concrete and green cement. That would be one way. And if you look at industry sectors around the world, you could actually do a lot to drop emissions by just focusing on one single thing at a time. Well, a lot of it at the same time would be even better. But even if you just focused on making cement green and concrete green, steel green that goes into concrete, you would have a huge impact on emissions. So we need to think creatively about verticals, you know, how to change the emission profile of countries vertically at the same time as creating lower energy buildings and green glass. So a lot of building materials take up a lot of energy to manufacture, and they need ventilation, even more so in a pandemic. So we've got to actually think vertically as well as, you know, at the place level.
The next question is for you, Bob, and perhaps for you as well, Scott. It's from Fred Sim, who says, thank you, Bob, for sharing about that experience with Scott and the faith element. And he asks, in an increasingly divided world, how can we reach out across the divide on issues where we can agree, even between perhaps atheists and people of faith?
Yeah, you know, I think that really sort of my journey on climate is indicative really of what we need to let other people take the same steps, right? And actually, it's all about grace. I've been extended a lot of grace from people who knew it was real long before I did, who have welcomed me into the conversation. And we really need that to happen elsewhere. In other words, for people who are and have been awakened to the problem of climate change, to welcome people who are only now figuring that out and extend grace to them, allow them into the conversation. Here in the United States, it's been a particularly effective political wedge that the left has used against the right. In fact, it's how my party, the Republican Party, lost control of the U.S. House in the 2018 midterm elections, because we lost suburban districts. And what we learned from that is you can't win suburban districts with a retro position on climate change. And so the wedge worked for the left. Now the question is whether the left can drop that wedge and welcome new entrants to this conversation and say, okay, come on, we need you. We need you in this conversation, without saying, you're the dumb kid in the class, the last one to get it. Because if you say that to them, it's not a very winsome way to begin the conversation. You know, you don't want to tell somebody that they're the dumb. So here I was, you know, on this trip at the Great Barrier Reef with Brian Baird, my friend, former member of Congress who's now retired. He's a Democrat, and he, you know, has a PhD and was aware of all these things. And I was sort of the GED. You know what GED is? That's what we have in America. That's a graduation equivalent degree or whatever. And it's like you didn't graduate from high school. So poor Scott Heron is hearing questions from Brian Baird at the postdoc level, and then my question from sort of the GED level, and he's going there and answering the question both. In other words, welcoming me into the conversation. So I've been extended a lot of grace. What I just say to the people listening here to us tonight, this morning for you, is please welcome those conservatives into the conversation. Mm-hmm. Don't treat them like the dumb, because if you welcome them and let them join in, we can solve this thing. Yeah. But if you turn on them and say, you know, you're the dumb, you finally enter the conversation, it ain't gonna go well. So extend them grace.
And I think if I can add on to that,
yes, go ahead.
That a lot of Bob's approach when addressing with the conservative constituency, I'm aware of, and has been very much speaking the right language, approaching at the commonality, and perhaps with respect to faith. And I thank Richard for his comment and various others as well as Fred for this question. I think there's a question that one of the key questions that I ask is the question of neighborhood. When it's recorded in the scripture that Jesus was asked the question, who is my neighbor? And I think if we can revisit the definition of neighbor, because in that particular portion of scripture, it was a stranger who became a friend. And when I look from a global perspective at who is my neighbor, I work in a lot of different spans and places globally. So I do some work with people who are located in other coral reef regions. I do work with UNESCO World Heritage and looking at those best of the best places in the world that we have defined, the cream of the crop, and the climate impacts and the vulnerabilities there. When I approach this, there is a human component as well, reflecting back on Lucy's comments there. There are people whose livelihoods depend on a healthy ecosystem. There are people whose households depend upon coastal protection. There are people who are connected to these systems. And from a faith perspective, I ask the question, who is my neighbor? When it comes to impacts of climate change, when it comes to impacts of the activities that we undertake, I come with the question of who is my neighbor, and my neighbor might be a person, a stranger, whom I've never met, whom I never will meet, who lives in a location that I will never visit, and yet they are still my neighbor. They are a stranger to whom I need to be a friend. And so that's a common language, a commonality piece there that I have learned out of the way that Bob has approached the conservative constituency and that I've gotten to see firsthand. And I have embraced as well in terms of my scientific interactions.
I might bring us back from that wonderful conversation, which really does warm me as an atheist even. I think that's a really wonderful approach and a useful one, but I might bring us back to the more grubby end of politics and the US presidential election before we wrap up.
That would be pretty grubby. That would be pretty grubby. Yes, indeed.
Bob, I wanted to ask you to reflect on, you've already made a really big, tough political decision that had very real life consequences for you when you pursued being a conservative Republican pursuing climate action. And I wondered, I think probably endorsing the Democratic presidential ticket is also a fairly big and consequential move for a self-described conservative Republican. And did that experience with climate and standing up for your values in that way really make it easier or have any influence when it came to thinking about your approach to the presidential election and making that decision to endorse Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think so, because once you cross the boundary of tribalism, and you find out that, you know, it isn't some other over there. They're just like us, actually. There isn't an other over there. Then it makes it easier to say, to just make a decision in this presidential race. I mean, I crossed that boundary by saying climate change is real at a time when Republicans were supposed to be saying, no, it's not real. We don't believe in it. You shouldn't either. You know, I mean, it was, that was the status in 2010, that election cycle. So having crossed that boundary, it was easier in this case to just say, well, of course, we have here I think it's a crisis moment for the United States. I mean, we have, I realize it's, you know, when you're traveling abroad, you're not supposed to criticize your own country because it makes people really mad back at home. So I'm sort of traveling abroad here. You know, I think we've got a crisis. We're losing standing around the world. And my main concern here in Donald Trump is that law is supported by norms that surround the law and that make the foundations of law secure. And if you erode norms around those foundations, then the foundations can crack. And so that's my great concern about Donald Trump. He's eroded on his own the presidential norms that we should not erode, because you can't, it's like Lucy knows about this built environment. If you start messing with the dirt all around your foundation, you can't count on that foundation to hold. And so, no, Ebony, it wasn't that hard. And it's just, it's like, I think it's just sort of obvious. But maybe that's because they're the reluctant Trump voters, and then there are people who are in the cult of Trump. And I will tell you, it really does look a great deal like a cult. They're people that suspend judgment. I mean, just go in faith in supporting this person who says things that just aren't true and are demonstrably false. You might even call them flat out lies. So don't hold back, Bob. Go ahead and tell us what you really think, okay? So, I mean, but mostly what I want to say to Australians is, please forgive us. I mean, we're going to come back to ourselves. Really, we will. Cousins.
Take a quick observation. I think Bob is obviously being very brave, coming out and saying what a advocate, and being such a strong advocate for climate change, action on climate change. But the good thing is, in terms of the amount of Republicans that are coming out with different voices, is very great. Like, there are thousands of Republicans. There are former military people. There are former members of Trump's cabinet, etc., who are coming out and saying things very loudly and clearly. So it's not like it's not the same landscape as it was in 2016. So I think my observation is that there is a real opportunity, just as, you know, the polity in both the US and Australia has been very fragmented and antagonistic. There is an opportunity for the polity to be stitched back together in this election if people come together around consensus of how the world should move forward to make it survivable, for one thing.
I might follow up from that with you, Lucy. As I said at the beginning, I think at the beginning of this pandemic in Australia, we did see, to a large extent, a lot of the politics drop away and a focus on what the medical experts were telling us that we really haven't seen in the climate debate. Do you see any optimism in at least the initial response that Australia had in terms of being able to build bipartisanship around climate and really valuing the expert advice and the science?
Well, I really hope so, but you don't want sort of like diversions, like, sort of saying, oh, let's do something transitionally. I think that would be a huge opportunity. If the COVID pandemic can let us do one thing, it's to rebuild, as I think it's Joe Biden's slogan, build back better. We can build a better and a stronger and a more energy efficient and carbon efficient, but also an economy where energy is actually cheaper if we build a decarbonised energy system. And that should be the big opportunity. And I wish there was more consensus around there than there is, but I hope it comes to that. I think the biggest tragedy that we had was that COVID came so close after the bushfires, which were like catastrophic for our environment and for so many people, and for the whole east coast of Australia. But then COVID kind of overwhelmed that. So I'm hoping that as the pandemic sort of retreats, God willing, that we can really get focused again on climate change as a way of rebuilding our economy better.
Yeah. Certainly the Australia Institute has been quite critical of, the idea of this gas-led recovery and huge government intervention, with really no direction on climate or energy policy. There's still a lot of very concerning signs in the Australian response there. We've only got a couple of minutes to go. So I guess I wondered if I might start with you, Lucy, and finish with you, Bob, reflect on, I guess, what's at stake in this United States presidential election, and I guess where you think we'll end up. Lucy.
Oh, well, I don't want to guess, but, and it's always not a good idea to completely follow the polls and have blind faith in the polls. But I would, if I was a betting person, which I certainly am not, I would say that there'll probably be a change of president.
Allan, I might ask you to... Yeah. Allan, did you want to add anything before we wrap up with Bob?
I think we live in a time of hope. And there's been plenty of despair around Ebony, but I think even in the United States, as people are beginning to look at the polls and looking at how the conversation is running, and I think that Bob might have something more to say about this just to complete. I think there are grounds for hope that the United States is not lost at all. It's got a really crazy president, but that's not going to last forever. And the United States has just got such a fabulous human resource base that it's totally, totally recoverable.
Thanks, Allan. And finally to you, Bob. I won't ask you about politics, Scott.
Yeah, so yes, to quote Winston Churchill, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. And so we've nearly exhausted every option. So we're going to do the right thing. And I am optimistic that there will be a change of administration. But I would say this, even if Donald Trump is reelected, we believe that there's a reappraisal coming in the Republican Party because even if he's reelected, he becomes a fairly quick lame duck. Reason, how can you out-Trump Trump? Already, if he gets reelected, the presidential campaign for 2024 will start immediately. In fact, Marco Rubio is already running and pushing away from Donald Trump. And Americans change presidential styles the way we change clothes styles, so we get tired of something and we try on a new style. And so Jimmy Carter was around with a cardigan sweater, and then we hired this guy an actor from California with tan suits and slick hair. And George Bush was sort of the swashbuckling guy, and then we got tired of that, and we hired this guy Obama, who is much more, intellectual, perhaps. And so, I think we're going to have a change. And further proof of that is even George H.W. Bush pushed off against Reagan, the guy who had put him on the ticket, made him vice president. Reagan was a popular president as he was leaving the White House. George H.W. Bush said that he was going to be kinder and gentler. So even if Trump is reelected, expect a Republican reappraisal, because the time frame for Donald Trump is now to November 3rd, and that's it. He has no more elections in him. That's it. But if you're any of the leadership in the House or the Senate, you're looking at 2022, 2024, 2026. You're seeing the demographic push on climate, that young people, conservatives and progressives, want action. And so those leaders are feeling it. Their time frame is longer, and so there will be a Republican reappraisal. It'll just come faster and more furious if Donald Trump loses and Joe Biden is made president.
Well, we might have to end it there. Thank you so much, Bob Inglis, Lucy Turnbull, Scott Heron, and Allan Behm. We really appreciate your time today. And thanks so much, everyone, for all your great questions. We've had more than 500 people on this webinar today, and it was really strong response, and thank you so much for joining us. Please join us over the next few weeks for more exciting webinars. If you haven't yet enrolled, it's not too late to sign up for our Economics Academy at the Australia Institute, where we take basic economic concepts and explain them in plain English so that you can participate in the national economic debate at a time when we're trying to pull Australia out of recession and when the federal government and state governments are spending public money at an unprecedented rate and not always in the most perfectly targeted ways. And next Wednesday, we'll be talking about the crisis facing the university sector with ANU Vice Chancellor and Nobel Laureate Professor Brian Schmidt, along with Andrew Norton from the ANU. And make sure you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. This week, I talked to Rod Campbell about why this federal budget was the most secretive ever. And in this week's episode, you can hear us talk about why the budget is one of the least transparent and the importance of the budget being transparent for all Australians. And lastly, wear a mask if you can, stay 1.5 meters away, and keep washing your hands and stay safe, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Evan.